European leaders have issued a statement commending President Trump's efforts to end the fighting in Ukraine. President Zelensky is expected to join a coalition of the willing meeting in London on Friday. It follows reports of a heated conversation at the White House between the US and Ukrainian leaders. In a statement released this morning, the leaders of the coalition of the willing said, "We strongly support President Trump's position that the fighting should stop immediately and that the current line of contact should be the starting point of negotiations. We remain committed to the principle that international borders must not be changed by force." Russia's stalling tactics have shown time and time again that Ukraine is the only party serious about peace. We can all see that Putin continues to choose violence and destruction. Therefore, we are clear that Ukraine must be in the strongest possible position before, during and after any ceasefire. We must ramp up the pressure on Russia's economy and its defence industry until Putin is ready to make peace. We're developing measures to use the full value of Russia's immobilised sovereign assets so that Ukraine has the resources it needs. Well, let's bring in Professor Michael Clarke, our defence and security analyst. Michael, what do you make of that statement?
Yeah, I mean, it's a statement that says we are behaving as if President Trump is consistent in wanting to push Putin to a ceasefire. So that's our line, and we wish him every success. But the coalition of the willing is also there for as and when, as they expect, this ceasefire will go nowhere. It won't happen. They need the coalition of the willing to support Ukraine. So it's the same coalition doing the same thing with the same sort of planning. So the first requirement is support President Trump in hope rather than expectation. And the second requirement is when expectations are that it fails, we will need the coalition. That's where they are. And it's interesting that they put into that statement lots of things that Trump doesn't talk about, like the need to build up Ukraine, the need for an immediate ceasefire, not a peace deal. I mean, President Trump went from a ceasefire to a peace deal, which is exactly what Putin wants, because he thinks he'll get the Donbass out of that and lots of other things besides. And the Europeans are saying, no, let's go back to where you were in March, President Trump. A ceasefire is the prerequisite, then to talk about the details. So the Europeans are behaving as if the White House is consistent, which we know it isn't, but they're pretending it is.
Pretending it is for diplomatic reasons,
yeah.
But they're also meeting on Friday, in a sense, moving ahead without him.
Yeah, and they move ahead on Thursday as well, because the EU meets on Thursday. And that may be the moment where they release or decide finally to release the frozen Russian assets in Europe. So there's 300 billion worth of frozen Russian assets in the world, over 300 billion. About 200 billion of them sit in Europe, most of them in Belgium, in the Euroclear system. So it's within the Belgian government's ability to release those assets. Now, they're not going to give them to Ukraine. What they're planning to do is to lend to Ukraine on a long-term basis at zero interest the value of those assets. Probably not all of them, but first tranche maybe 160 billion. And the Ukrainians will have to pay them back when the Russians pay reparations for the war. So, sometime never. But that's the mechanism. And they've worked out the mechanism. The button is there to be pressed if there is a big enough consensus on Thursday to press it. I think there probably is, because the Europeans are desperate. Now, they're desperate to do something to actually keep Ukraine in the war, because the Ukrainians need about 100 billion a year in foreign aid to keep going. And this 300 billion of frozen assets would keep them going for a while.
What do you think Russia's thought process is about that? I mean, I suppose this is money from Russian oligarchs. This is money from big Russian companies. Obviously, Putin won't like it.
He won't. And most of the money...
Does he care that much?
Yeah, most of the money is from the central bank money, and that's, in a way, is less personal. But there's a lot of oligarchs' money there as well. It's I think about 25% of it is private. About 75% of it, roughly, is central bank. They will pretend they care about all of it, and they'll make legal representations. They'll challenge it legally, almost without any hope of success, but they will do that. And they'll retaliate. And so they'll retaliate not against America, but against the Europeans. So, more hybrid warfare, more sub-threshold actions we would expect. So the sort of things we saw a month ago, which have toned down in the last couple of weeks, interestingly.
Oh, the drones around the airports.
Drones, air violations, stuff at sea. You'd expect that to ramp up, because what the Russians want to do is to increase the cost to the Europeans of supporting Ukraine if America is pulling out. If America stops supporting Ukraine, it's quite close to that now already, they want to increase the cost to the Europeans of continuing to support Ukraine. And so we can expect it's going to be a rough ride, yeah.
So let's move from there to the Middle East. J.D. Vance has touched down in Israel to discuss the ceasefire. And we've had this social post from President Trump in the last half an hour talking about great allies in the Middle East, saying that they would welcome the opportunity to go into Gaza to straighten out Hamas. What do you make of Trump's statement, first of all?
I just saw that as I sat down. He doesn't say which allies, of course, and there are no obvious rules of engagement for this. I mean, one of the things that we know that Jared Kushner, who's there, and Steve Witkoff and J.D. Vance are talking about is getting this stabilisation force in place. And we were saying over a week ago, for every day that this stabilisation force doesn't turn up in Gaza, the situation will tend to drift away, as indeed it is. You know, it's still just about holding, but we expect it to slip away unless somebody can get in the middle of them. But I still puzzle which Middle Eastern countries, which Gulf countries, Egypt, Turkey, I don't know, are prepared to put 5,000 troops or more into Gaza when the situation is slipping away with no obvious rules of engagement. Now, it's possible it may happen if the Americans both lean on them and bully them and reward them hugely for putting their troops in harm's way. But it's a huge political risk for any of the Gulf states or say, Egypt or Turkey are the two most likely in military terms to be able to do it. And who can get 5,000 troops quickly there, properly equipped, properly trained, ready, with rules of engagement that have not yet, as far as we know, been worked out? Now, we know the Americans have got their CENTCOM group in Israel. They're 200 officers or ranked personnel who are there to coordinate. So they've probably been working very hard behind the scenes. And President Trump, as always, issues these hugely optimistic statements that are light on detail. If CENTCOM, by the end of today or tomorrow, releases a statement that the stabilisation force is beginning to take shape, then I'll take it seriously.
What do you make of Vance being there in the region? Brought his wife Usha along as well. You look at that and you think, would other politicians necessarily bring their other half?
No, that's
very high-profile Middle East.
Yeah, no, you wouldn't think so, would you? But I mean, that was the issue with going to Greenland as well. Yeah. You know, go to watch the dog sled racing. It's a strange thing to do. I mean, the White House behaves in these rather, unconventional diplomatic ways. But I mean, that may indeed have something to do with the humanitarian issue, because the UN is saying that they need to get 200 tons of aid a day into Gaza. 2,000 tons of aid a day, and they're getting 750 tons in. So they're getting less than half a day into Gaza. Only 2 of the crossings are open. There are 7 crossings. Only 2 are open, none of them in the north. And I suspect if she is there, it will be to talk to Mrs. Netanyahu, for instance, and say, what's going on in Gaza really is unacceptable. It's upsetting people in the States. Please talk to your husband about this. That's what I would guess, anyway.
Soft power, in a sort of real sense. Michael, thank you very much for now.